Recently, the European Union held elections for their parliament. The inner workings of this supranational organization can be difficult for those inside the Union and outside. Join us in this endeavor, where we will take a journey through the complex EU institutions and how they function, boiling them down for you to enjoy. The legislative branch of the EU resides in the EU Parliament. This institution meets in Brussels, Belgium, and Strasbourg, France. The European Parliament fulfills three of the basic functions of a parliamentary body. It controls the budgetary function, in theory could impeach the President of the EU Commission, and presides over the approval of legislation. It's important to note, the EU Parliament does not hold legislative initiative. It cannot propose new laws or repeal existing laws already on the book. It can only approve or reject legislation that is handed over to them by the Commission, effectively acting as a rubber stamp. This contrasts with most parliamentary branches in the world, as other parliaments do have the capacity to propose and debate laws without intervention from other, separate governmental branches. The EU parliamentary body is comprised of 751 members of the European Parliament, each belonging to a representative voting bloc, further comprised by grouping together smaller, national parties with similar ideological goals. Members are elected once every 5 years by direct vote from citizenry within member states. Citizens vote for their MEPs based on their local parties, who then comprise the EU parties once they take their seat at the European Parliament. It's worth noting that European elections reach anywhere between 40 to 60%, the most recent one reaching around 50%. In addition, MEPs only participate in a little over a half of all parliamentary meetings. Each member state has a minimum number of assigned seats of 6, increasing by total population of each state. The Commission is an interesting body to say the least. They are the executive branch of the EU. The President of the Commission is proposed by the Council of Europe and then approved by the Parliament. As of writing, the current interim President of the Commission is Jean-Claude Juncker. The President then appoints 27 commissars, much like state secretaries in the US or ministers in Spain, one from each member state. The whole of the 27 commissars must be approved by the Parliament. That is to say, the Parliament must vote on the commissars as a group, and not individually. This body of commissars, together with the President, draft legislation to be approved by the Parliament. For example, Directive on Copyright in the Digital Single Market, better known as Articles 11 and 13, now known as 15 and 17. An additional side note, the administrative division, the Commission, is comprised of the College of Commissioners and 38,000 workers. The European Council is the third branch of the Union. They meet in a building called the Europa Building, commonly known as the Egg. The Council is composed of 28 heads of state, such as the Chancellor, President, or Prime Minister of each member state, as well as the President of the EU Council, who acts as the symbolic head of the European Union. The Council is in charge of all important appointments, especially the President of the Commission himself. They meet every 3 months to discuss and debate EU policy, a strictly political body. They don't have any direct legislative or executive functions, like the other two branches, but they decide the direction of future European policy. They meet at events called summits to steer EU policy as the heads of state, in theory, expressing the will of the member states. The Council regularly produces a document called the Conclusions of the Presidency, which outlines future legislation for the Commission, general EU policy, for the next 3 months. For example, the Council may decide one summit to ruin the Internet for all European citizens and direct the Commission to write articles to do such. By now, you must be wondering, what's with all these appointed offices and this lack of elected officials? Well, simply put, the EU is notoriously unaccountable to the citizens which it governs. Taking a look into the general population's control on decision-making within the Union, the decisions start off in the Council, mostly made up of elected officials, as they are the heads of member states, but know that each member state only has power over 1/28 of the organization. The members of this institution represent about half of the population of the states they come from, given they are elected via majority vote. Next, the process moves over to the Commission, entirely composed of unelected officials. This body drafts the laws and proposes them to Parliament. It's in this step where the general population gets its say. Through majority vote, about half of the EU population is left out of the process. The voters whose party went against the decision are not taken into account at all. This is particularly egregious in cases where certain member states are radically in opposition, while other member states are in approval. The majority imposes their will upon the minority. While that is generally the case in most democracies, this entails theoretically sovereign nations having legislation imposed on them against their will. Again, we stress the examples of Articles 11 and 13, which were immensely opposed by Poland's MEPs, but overridden by other member states. Let us not forget that according to polling, the majority of the population of the Union was in opposition to these sweeping internet reforms, especially in Poland, where they argued it was forbidden in the Polish constitution but also in the EU treaties. This brings us to a conclusion. The EU has a clear democratic deficit. Vladimir Bukovsky, once a not-so-proud card-carrying victim of a Soviet gulag, has compared the functioning of the USSR to that of the European Union. The USSR too was ruled over by an unelected body that appointed itself called the Politburo and featured a parliament, the Supreme Soviet, that had no legislative initiative. As a more unsettling comparison, both organizations are committed to their own state-sanctioned ideology. Communism for the USSR, and in the European Union, so-called European values, enshrined into EU law, allowing the organization to punish member states for not complying. This has been done to take away the voting rights of Hungary within the European Union, particularly in the Council, where Viktor Orban from Hungary is wholly unwelcome. With the new creation of the EU Continental Army, once touted as a conspiracy theory, but now openly in the works, many are worried that these European values will begin to be enforced with violence, especially following the response to the Gilets jaunes protests in France. This has raised more than eyebrows in Eastern member states, who bitterly remember the invasions of the Warsaw Pact, when they too did not follow the official ideology of the Soviet Union. Whether you agree or not with this analogy, it should be plain to see that the will of the European people has very little say in the matters of what goes on in the European Union, and that the mandate it has given itself as a power unto itself, above the states that comprise it, is troubling, to say the least. That members of the Parliament, leaders of some of the largest voting blocs, are demanding that the EU rise up and become an empire for good, should be unsettling to everyone who hears those words. After all, when was the last time an empire was run democratically?